What if the very people you trusted to run your business were planning to burn it down and blame you for it? Hello to all our wise, hardworking listeners, those who know the true value of sweat, legacy, and loyalty. Today's story isn't just about sabotage, it's about resilience, undercover grit, and a second chance at honor. You're about to hear how a mechanic turned owner uncovered betrayal in his own auto shop and stopped $1 million fraud with nothing but a hoodie, a wrench, and the truth. Stay tuned, because this one will grip your heart and light up your sense of justice. The sharp smell of scorched rubber still clung to the air when Calvin Harris walked into the service bay of Harrison's Auto Care at sunrise. The night crew had filed a report claiming it was just a faulty fuse box above lift 3. One of those freak sparks, they said. But the singed concrete beneath the car and the charred edge of the fire suppression hose told a more sobering story. If the automated safety system hadn't kicked in when it did, it might have been looking at a body bag. Calvin crouched by the lift in silence, his calloused fingers brushing over the melted insulation of a cable that hadn't failed by chance. Somebody planned this, he muttered to himself. In his office, the grainy security footage offered little comfort. The system had glitched again, conveniently cutting out between 11:37 and 11:58 p.m. The fire started at 11:42. That made 5 separate tech outages in the past 3 months, always right before parts went missing or maintenance reports got lost. Calvin rubbed his temples, scanning his log books for anything that made sense. Profit margins were slipping, even with steady business. Inventory numbers were inconsistent. Vendors were delivering more than what showed in the shop. None of it added up. He'd built Harrison's from scratch, 1 lift, 1 wrench, and a rusted-out pickup 30 years ago. It wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline. A place where veterans like Eddie found purpose again, where kids like Leo got their first shot, and now someone was trying to burn it down, either slowly through theft or literally with fire. He had confronted Troy, his polished MBA slick operations manager, weeks ago, but Troy gave him nothing but spreadsheets, charm, and plausible deniability. Calvin sat back in his chair, staring at the framed photo of his first garage. Him, 26, sweaty and smiling, arm slung around his late wife. He'd promised her this shop would be a legacy. Now it was slipping through his fingers like oil through a cracked pan. The worst part? Everyone treated him like a relic, just the guy who signed checks. They didn't know he still remembered how every bolt in this building fit together. He stood and grabbed the worn navy hoodie from the back of the door. The disguise was simple, but it would do. No owner, no clipboard, just a traveling mechanic named Rick looking for honest work. If someone in his house was lighting matches, he wasn't going to wait until it all turned to ash. He was going back under the lifts, undercover, where the damage had started, because the fuse hadn't blown yet. But if he waited any longer, it wouldn't matter. By Monday afternoon, the transformation was complete. Calvin Harris, clean-shaven, buttoned-up owner, was gone. In his place stood Rick, a quiet, road-weary mechanic with oil-streaked jeans, a faded hoodie, and a trucker cap pulled low. He walked into his own shop side entrance carrying a rusted toolbox, careful to avoid the main office, where Janice might recognize him. No one batted an eye. Marcus, the front desk rep barely out of high school, handed him a clipboard without looking up from his phone. "You fill in from downstate?" he asked. "Yep," Calvin answered, drawing out a southern drawl he hadn't used in years. "Just passing through." The smell of oil, sweat, and brake dust was familiar, comforting even. It had been years since Calvin had stood beside a lift, torque wrench in hand. Now, he blended in among the din of pneumatic hisses and the clatter of metal trays, as anonymous as any other contractor. He observed more than he spoke, watching how the team worked. Or didn't. The shop felt different, less pride, more shortcuts. Cars rushed in and out with minimal oversight. One mechanic reused brake fluid from an open bottle. Another signed off on an inspection without opening the hood. When Troy Landon finally emerged from the back office, Calvin stiffened. The younger man, once a loyal protege, strode through the bay with calculated confidence, clipboard in hand, offering tight smiles and pats on the back. He didn't even glance at Calvin. "Keep it tight, boys. We've got a monthly target to hit," Troy said, then disappeared behind the one-way glass of the management suite. Calvin caught sight of Leo, the teenage apprentice, scrubbing a grease trap by hand. The kid noticed him watching and offered a nod. Cautious. Curious. Calvin nodded back, but said nothing. His role wasn't to fix anything, yet. His job now was to listen, to wait, to gather proof. Whatever was rotting Harrison's auto care wasn't just bad habits or bad luck. It was something deeper. The only way to find it was to work shoulder to shoulder with the people who no longer knew him. Rick the Drifter would be invisible. And that made him dangerous. The next day, Calvin found Leo crouched behind the dumpster, wrist deep in a pile of discarded parts boxes and half-used shop supplies. "Looking for buried treasure?" Calvin asked, keeping his voice light. Leo flinched, then sighed, wiping sweat and grease across his forearm. "Just checking to see what they threw out this time," he muttered. Calvin crouched beside him, quietly observing the young man sort through a box labeled fuel pumps. "Those were marked delivered 2 nights ago," Calvin said, testing the waters. Leo paused, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, but I never saw them used. I think someone's faking delivery receipts. Boxes come in, then disappear. Troy says not to ask questions." Calvin leaned against the brick wall and let out a quiet breath. "Have you ever noticed the cameras?" Leo looked up, instantly alert. "They've been pointing the wrong way for weeks. Troy said they were upgrading the system. But the new ones? Only cover the customer side, blind spots everywhere else." The kid was sharper than most of the crew. Calvin could see the worry in his face. Fear, but also anger, that dangerous mix of knowing too much and not having any power. Calvin took a gamble. "Look, Leo, my name's not Rick. I'm Calvin Harris. I built this place. I've been watching because something's off, and I think you know it too." Leo stared at him, stunned. "Why'd you come back like this?" "Because if I walked in as the boss, no one would tell me the truth. But you just did." For a moment, Leo didn't speak. Then he stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "I need this job," he said quietly, "but I'm not going to help burn it down." Calvin nodded. "Help me stop it, and you'll do more than keep your job. You'll help save a legacy." Leo hesitated, then extended his hand. "Deal." That handshake changed everything. Calvin didn't just have an ally, he had someone who had seen the rot up close. Someone invisible to the crooks, but invaluable to the mission. Together, they walked back into the shop. 2 grease-stained mechanics among many, but now they were on the same side. And the fuse was still ticking. The address was scrawled in the corner of a forged invoice Leo had tucked into Calvin's palm 2 nights earlier. A nondescript lot on the edge of town, listed as Pro Torque Logistics. On a gray Wednesday morning, Calvin drove out alone, parking a block away and walking the rest of the distance on foot. The warehouse looked abandoned from the front, faded signage, rusted loading dock, cracked windows. But around the back, Calvin spotted tire tracks cutting through fresh gravel and a motion-activated security light that flicked on at his approach. He crouched behind a stack of pallets across the alley and watched. Within minutes, a black delivery van pulled up, its side panel bearing the same vendor logo he'd seen on multiple falsified parts receipts back at Harrison's. 2 men exited, one of them unmistakably Greg Sims, Troy's trusted supplier. From his vantage point, Calvin saw them unlock the service entrance and begin unloading boxes. He couldn't see the labels, but he didn't need to. Every box shape was familiar. Filters, hoses, sealed electronics. All of them had Harrison's Auto Care part numbers stamped in faded ink. And then he saw it. A dry erase board mounted on the inside wall, visible through a broken pane. Scrawled across it in red marker was a simple phrase: Friday, 11:58 p.m. Go. Underneath were 3 initials: TL, GS, and MH. Calvin snapped photos with his phone, each click of the shutter matching the thud of betrayal in his chest. He zoomed in on the board, the shipping labels, the delivery van's license plate. Every detail mattered now. This wasn't theft. It wasn't even fraud. This was an organized heist wrapped in corporate paperwork. With arson as the final smokescreen, they were going to burn his shop to the ground, to erase the evidence, file the insurance claim, and walk away. Back in his truck, he immediately called Fire Chief Reynolds, an old friend who owed him a favor. "Have you ever seen an insurance file on Harrison's submitted by Troy Landon?" There was a pause. "Yeah," Reynolds said slowly. "He requested a coverage increase, tripled the fire protection on the main garage 2 months ago, said you approved it." Calvin's jaw tightened. "I didn't." It's all aligned now. Troy had set the timeline, planted the motive, and forged Calvin's signature on the paperwork. If the fire went through, Calvin would not only lose everything, he'd likely be facing criminal charges. Back at home, Calvin pulled every invoice, vendor contact, and parts record from the last 6 months. The paper trail all pointed to ProTorque Logistics, a shell company Troy had set up and funneled Harrison's stolen inventory into. The final piece wasn't just the theft, it was the fall guy setup. Calvin leaned back, exhausted but clear-eyed. They thought he'd walk away quietly. Instead, he had just found the matchbook they were about to strike. And now, he had 4 days to build the firebreak. By Thursday morning, Calvin knew he couldn't stop this alone. The scheme was bigger than he'd feared, and the fire was just the final act in a months-long performance. It was time to assemble the people who actually cared about Harrison, not the ones cashing in. He started with Janice. She'd been with the shop for over 20 years and knew every part, order, payroll cycle, and vendor ID by heart. He caught her before the morning shift and laid everything out: photos, invoices, the warehouse. Her expression hardened with every word. "Troy's been changing logins and freezing me out," she said. "I thought it was just micromanagement. I didn't realize he was staging a robbery with me as a witness." She was in before Calvin even asked. Next came Eddie, the grizzled tech who remembered when Harrison's had only 2 lifts and a swamp cooler. Calvin found him torquing down a suspension and waved him aside. "I've got something ugly to show you." Eddie listened in silence, hands on hips. When Calvin finished, Eddie nodded once. "You need someone watching the back door, and someone who can smell a stage fire from a mile away. That's me." Leo, the sharp-eyed apprentice, was already on board, but now Calvin gave him a real role, running surveillance. "We can't trust the current camera system," Calvin explained. "Troy rigged it to loop fake footage. We need our own setup, something mobile, off-grid." Leo lit up. "I've got spare wireless cams from a project I never finished. I can rig them through my laptop and broadcast to a private network. We'll have eyes everywhere, and he won't know it." Together, they outlined the counterplan at an old storage unit Calvin had kept from his early days. Blueprints of the shop were spread across a workbench. Janice would plant marked cash and decoy paperwork in the safe. Eddie would prep the shop for a closing shift that never existed. Leo would install hidden cameras and reroute the suppression system just enough to keep it ready without triggering suspicion. "Keep your routines. No sudden changes," Calvin said, pointing at the red circle on the calendar, Friday, midnight. "We give them just enough rope to hang themselves, but when the spark hits the fuse, we'll be the ones holding the fire extinguisher." The team nodded. For the first time in weeks, Calvin felt the shift. He wasn't alone. The real mechanics were on his side. Friday arrived with the deceptive stillness of a windless storm. Calvin, still in his Rick persona, pulled into the shop's back lot at 3:45 p.m., hours ahead of schedule, and parked near the junker pile. From there, he had an unobstructed view of the service bays, the office, and the back exit, just as they'd mapped out. Inside, Harrison's auto care hummed with its usual rhythm, but the air was different, thicker, tense, like the building itself knew something was about to happen. In the break room, Janice slipped the marked envelope into the safe and casually removed the real cash deposits, stashing them in a locked drawer. She logged everything in the system as usual, her face a mask of routine boredom. No one suspected a thing. At 5:00 p.m., Leo arrived under the guise of helping with parts inventory, his laptop case slung over one shoulder. By 5:15, he had installed 4 wireless cameras, one tucked behind the office clock, one inside a broken vending machine shell near the service counter, another under Bay 3's tool chest, and the last inside a false ceiling tile above the electrical panel. Each camera streamed silently to his laptop, now stashed in the trunk of a parked car across the street. His quiet excitement masked the nerves bouncing in his chest. He was 17, with a scholarship promise, and now the tech lead in a real-life sting operation. Eddie worked the floor, supervising repairs while subtly prepping the fire suppression system for override. The trick wasn't to disable it, but to make it seem disabled. He cut the false indicator light on the panel and rerouted the backup power, ensuring the system would still trigger even if Troy thought it was off. By 7:30 p.m., Eddie had placed heat sensors behind the fry panel. Troy had flagged for a scheduled fuse issue. Every tool was precisely where it needed to be. Every piece of real inventory was replaced with decoys, empty boxes filled with scrap metal and labeled to match expensive components. Throughout it all, Calvin kept his role low-key, moving between cars, logging hours, and staying just visible enough. He caught Marcus in the hallway at 8:00, whispering into his phone, "Everything's set, just like Troy said. Nobody suspects a thing." Calvin gritted his teeth, but said nothing. At 9:15, the final piece clicked into place. Greg Sims texted Troy, "Van loaded, ETA 11:20. They were coming, and the shop rigged with cameras, filled with decoys, and manned by a crew of loyalists, was ready. The ghosts of stolen parts, fake invoices, and betrayal would all surface tonight. And if Troy thought this was his big escape, he was about to learn something about real mechanics. They don't leave loose bolts. At 11:19 p.m., the shop was officially closed for maintenance, just as Troy had planned. The last legitimate customer had rolled out an hour earlier, and all lights except those in the service bay were dimmed. The crew appeared to have left for the night. Marcus, Shay, and Eddie all went through the front, waving goodnight. But they hadn't gone far. Hidden cameras were live. Leo sat hunched in the back seat of Janice's Corolla across the street, monitoring 4 separate feeds on his laptop, earbuds in, breath tight. Janice was still inside, playing the role of manager finishing the books, while Calvin, still in his grease-streaked hoodie, pretended to nod off in the lounge chair near Bay 2. The trap was set. At exactly 11:27 p.m., Troy entered through the back door with a swipe of his master keycard, followed closely by Greg Sims and a heavy-set man in a dark windbreaker. Mitch, the muscle. Greg wheeled in a dolly, already loaded with boxes marked Fuel Pumps Premium, while Mitch headed straight for the office with a crowbar. "Safe's right where she said it'd be," he grunted. Troy's voice was calm, confident. "Load the van, stage the panel, and go. We've got 25 minutes. Troy flicked the switch on the main electrical panel, the one they'd rigged to short. A faint spark crackled near the fry panel. Eddie's planted fuse reacting, as expected. Mitch grinned. "Looks real." Then Shay slipped in through the side door, wearing gloves and holding a red gas can. "Just a little splash by the breaker box," she said. "Nothing that won't catch easy." From the back hallway, Calvin watched it all unfold through the small crack in the utility door. He waited. He needed them mid-act, boxes in hand, cash lifted, accelerant set. At 11:42 p.m., the final piece clicked. Troy pulled out a lighter and nodded to Shay. "Time to erase the evidence." That's when Calvin stepped out of the shadows. "Might want to hold off on that spark, Troy." Troy spun around, eyes widening. "What the... Rick?" Calvin pulled off the hoodie and cap, standing in the full glow of the overhead work light. "Name's Calvin Harris, owner, founder. The man who taught you how to bleed brake lines and balance a carburetor. And you really thought I wouldn't recognize what a scam smells like?" The service bay lights exploded to full power as Leo triggered the override. From above, The sprinkler system hissed to life, but only over the fry panel, dousing Shay and the lighter in a cascade of freezing water. Mitch moved for the door, only to find Eddie blocking it, holding a torque wrench with calm menace. Janice stepped from the office, holding a folder of forged invoices. "We've got every bit of it. Audio, video, inventory logs. You're done." Troy, soaked in sweat and disbelief, stared at Calvin. "You can't prove I meant to burn it down." "You're standing in a crime scene with your name all over it," Calvin said coldly. "And if you ever really knew me, you'd have known one thing. These hands built this place, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let you burn it down." By Monday morning, the news had already spread across town. Attempted arson foiled at Harrison's Auto Care. Local headlines praised the owner's courageous, undercover operation. And the police chief held a press conference confirming charges of insurance fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit arson against Troy Landon, Greg Sims, Shay, and Mitch. But inside the shop, Calvin Harris wasn't basking in victory. He was sweeping up broken glass near the office door, sleeves rolled up like he used to in the early days. That's how he rebuilt things, not by replacing them, but by restoring them with care. He promoted Janice to general manager that same morning. "You kept the lights on," he said, handing her a new badge. "Now help me keep 'em honest." She accepted it without a smile, only a steady nod, the kind that came from loyalty, not gratitude. In the service bay, Eddie supervised the rewiring of the electrical panel alongside the city's fire inspection crew. "Had a feeling that the old fuse didn't go out on its own," one of the firemen said, and he just grunted. "Things don't break unless someone's trying to break them." And then there was Leo. Calvin called him into the office and handed him an envelope. Not cash, but a formal letter. "Full scholarship," Calvin said. "You're going to community college on Harrison's dime, and when you're ready, I want you to run IT for all our shops." Leo blinked, speechless, before pulling Calvin into a tight, awkward hug. "You believed in me before I even knew how to believe in myself," the kid said. The security system was rebuilt, this time with triple redundancy, and individual access codes for every employee. Cameras were added not to spy, but to protect. Calvin also announced a profit-sharing model for full-time staff and an internal apprenticeship program. It wasn't about fixing a business anymore. It was about reinforcing a foundation of trust that had been quietly eroding for years. Looking out at the staff from his rebuilt office, now with no blinds and an open-door policy, Calvin felt something stir. Not pride, exactly. Something deeper. Resilience. He hadn't just stopped a fire. He'd reignited something that had been flickering out. Belief in the kind of place where honest work still mattered. Where you don't throw it away when it's broken. You rebuild it. 3 months later, the hum of impact wrenches and the scent of motor oil still filled the air at Harrison's Auto Care. But something was different. The shop buzzed with energy, not just from engines, but from purpose. Calvin stood near the reception counter, wearing a crisp navy button-down instead of a hoodie, shaking hands with a group of wide-eyed vocational students who had just finished their first tour. "You'll get dirty here," he told them, smiling. "But you'll also learn the kind of work that sticks with you. The kind that doesn't just fix cars, but builds character." A framed plaque on the wall behind him read, "Built by hands, protected by heart." Next to it hung 2 photos. One, a grainy shot from the day Calvin opened the original 2-bay garage with his late wife. The other, taken just last month, showed the entire staff gathered outside the shop beneath a handmade banner that read, "Welcome to the Apprentice Program." Leo stood front and center in that photo, wearing a Harrison's polo, his arm around Janice, who now managed daily operations like a seasoned captain. The shop had changed from top to bottom, profit sharing, reduced turnover to nearly zero. Employees stayed late not out of fear but pride. A monthly rotation of mentorships paired senior techs with newer hires, fostering the kind of culture Calvin had once taken for granted. Customers noticed too. Word of mouth doubled their foot traffic, and even the mayor dropped by last week to recognize Harrison's with the city's Small Business Leadership Award. And Troy, he'd taken a plea deal, 2 years in county plus restitution. Calvin hadn't gone to the sentencing. He didn't need to. The justice system had done its job. His job was here. Grease under his fingernails some days, business meetings on others, always grounded by the shop floor. As the students filed out, one lingered. A shy girl in safety goggles turned to him and asked, "Did you really go undercover just to catch a thief?" Calvin chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," he said. "I went undercover to remember what I built, and to protect the people I built it for." That evening, as the bay doors rolled down and the last brake light disappeared down the street, Calvin walked the length of the shop alone. He ran his fingers along the lift posts, the workbenches, the walls his hands had helped raise decades ago. He wasn't just a business owner anymore. He was a mentor, a protector, a builder. Still leading, but never above the work. These hands, once calloused by labor, now carried a legacy, not just to fix, but to guide. The story of Harrison's Auto Care is a powerful reminder that real leadership is earned in silence and proven in action. Calvin Harris didn't save his business by barking orders or hiding behind spreadsheets. He got his hands dirty, walked among his people, and listened. In doing so, he uncovered not just a plot to destroy everything he built, but also the cracks in his own leadership. The biggest lesson? You don't protect a legacy by standing above it. You preserve it by standing inside it. This story teaches us that trust isn't just given, it's built, bolt by bolt, moment by moment. When you invest in people, not just profits, you create a culture that can't be burned down. Even in betrayal, there's a chance to rebuild something stronger, more honest, more human. And perhaps the most timeless truth: integrity isn't a policy, it's a practice. One that starts with knowing the value of your work, your name, and the hands that built both. In a world chasing shortcuts, Calvin showed that character is the long road, and the only one worth taking. Rebuild, don't replace. That's how real legacies survive.